it in a minute.
Right, we're live.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody to SMART's webinar series for SMART facilitators. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Cathy Kezelman, President of Blue Knot Foundation. Today, Cathy and I are going to be in conversation about trauma-informed care, and it's a kind of how-to guide for SMART facilitators. So we hope you find it enormously practical and useful. Today we're meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to its owners, elders past, present and emerging, and also to welcome any Aboriginal people who might be listening today. Cathy's joining us from Wurundjeri Territory in Melbourne. Welcome, Cathy. Cathy's a medical practitioner. She's president of Blue Knot Foundation, the National Centre for Excellence for Complex Trauma. Cathy has her own history of childhood trauma. Under Cathy's stewardship, Blue Knot Foundation has grown from a peer support organisation to a national organisation, combining a lived experience voice with that of researchers, academics, clinicians, and they advocate very strongly for trauma-informed change and informed responses to complex trauma. Cathy's a prominent voice in the media, increasingly so, and at conferences. She's also the co-author of multiple seminal books and Blue Knot Foundation publications, and we'll give you a list of those and links to them at the end of this webinar. But welcome, Cathy. It's really, really exciting to have you here today. This is a really important conversation and an opportunity for us to kind of grow a core competency, I think, that all of our SMART facilitators really, really need. It's really hard for participants to turn up to it this time. And being trauma-informed is just one of the ways in which we can interact with people in a way that is actually empowering and validates their experience. We want all of what we do to be strengths-based, and we want what happens in a group to not just be about what we say or what we do, but actually how we engage with people. So you're the kind of master of this terrain, and it's delightful to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, thanks so much. I mean, our view is really that the whole world needs to be trauma-informed.
Absolutely. So, Cathy, can I just start with the basic questions first? What is trauma? What are we talking about here when we use the word trauma?
Yeah, look, trauma is an event or events that really threaten to overwhelm our ability to cope, and that occurs from threat or the perception of threat. And we all have physiological responses to that. Most people have heard of a fight, flight, fear response, and that's a normal biological response to stress. But what happens in people who experience trauma, and that's repeated stress, is that instead of the fight, flight, freeze response going back to a steady state, what we call homeostasis, people stay on high alert and they become quite allergic to stress. So they're very readily activated by seemingly minor stress, but in the context of what they've experienced, it makes a lot of sense.
For sure. What do we know about the prevalence of trauma in Australia at the moment?
Look, we know sadly that there are infinite ways that people can experience trauma, past and present. Our organisation works with people who've experienced childhood trauma. That's child abuse in all its forms, neglect, growing up with domestic violence, and growing up with a parent who has their own unresolved trauma from mental illness or substance abuse. And we know that that's 5 million Australian adults, and that's just a phenomenal number of people. I mean, we've just had a Royal Commission and we saw, the number of people with over 8,000 people gave testimony in private sessions, and there were more queued up to do that. Yeah, so sadly it's highly prevalent.
Yeah. How did you become involved in your current work?
Look, I mean, I've got my own lived experience of trauma. I was a GP for over 20 years, and it wasn't until my mid-40s that my trauma experience was triggered, that I started having to deal with it. It was the death of my niece, which triggered another sudden death, the death of my father, and that hadn't been processed. And that just started a whole lot of unravelling. And what I found was that, being a medico didn't help at all. I had no idea what was happening to me. I thought I was going mad. I was experiencing flashbacks. I was being thrown back into being a 3, 4, 5-year-old child in abject terror, experiencing sensations and emotions and movements that I couldn't make sense of. So that's how I got involved, and there's nothing like a personal experience to make one passionate.
Absolutely. How then does that kind of personal experience translate to just how the impact of trauma affects all of our community, the families and everybody that we work with? Like, what we would be seeing in a regular smart group, do you think? In terms
Look,
of...
I mean, people who, trauma plays out in all sorts of ways. Particularly when it's occurred in childhood, it means that instead of being able to learn and explore the world confidently, people often stay in survival mode. And that can make people fairly rigid or apparently controlling. They have a lot of trouble regulating their emotions. Their levels of arousal can go up and down, so sometimes they may be agitated, easily startled, and other times they may be shut down and unresponsive. So there are a lot of physiological responses to trauma, which, again, can be explained by what happens in our body and mind.
Sure. And so given the kind of numbers that you were talking about in terms of prevalence, it's very likely that lots of the people that would be attending a smart meeting, for example, would be there trying to manage trauma on top of the other stuff that they're trying to manage.
Yeah, look, I mean, we know that, 2/3 of people who attend mental health services have experienced either sexual or physical abuse. And the same, sort of figures apply to substance abuse, to people in the criminal justice system. Sadly, the impacts of trauma, because particularly with childhood, it occurs often repetitively so, it's often extreme. It's often perpetrated by the very, very people who are meant to care for and nurture a child. And so it happens while the brain's developing. And as you can understand, that impacts the way the brain works together. Normally, the functions of the brain are integrated, they work together, but what trauma does is separate those functions. And so our beliefs and our sensations and our feelings and emotions can become separate from one another and from our consciousness. And obviously that creates a lot of challenge in the world. And the other thing that, trauma does is really affect the development of a core sense of self, the ability to have a relationship with yourself, a relationship with others. And as we said, physical, mental health, challenges with everyday functioning. The impacts are potentially profound. And yes, many people in your groups would have lived experiences of past and current traumas.
For sure, yeah. So can you just explain the basics to us in terms of what is the stress response and what does it do to the brain and body?
Yeah, so the stress response is a response which comes out of the it's called the reptilian section of the brain, the brainstem, which is there to really for us to survive, helps to regulate arousal. And when we're stressed, that area is primed. And so we react from that reptilian brain. And also there's another area called the limbic system, which helps to evaluate threat and evaluate fear and emotions. And that comes engaged too. But what happens in those situations is that our thinking, reflecting part of our brain, the cortex, goes offline. And we all know that when we're highly stressed and agitated, we can't think, we can't process. And what happens in children and adults who've experienced lots of trauma is that they're caught in this loop of reactivity. And their stress response, as I said before, just doesn't go back to a steady state. So people, often don't develop the ability to reflect and the cognitive processes that we all need to make sense of our lives and make meaning. Because you're stuck in the more basic survival responses.
Okay, so when people talk about things like hyper-arousal and hypo-arousal, what are those things and what is that about?
Yeah, so hyper-arousal. So both hyper-arousal and hypo-arousal are normal stress responses. And we know that people who've experienced recurrent stress or traumatic stress have what we call is a very narrow window of tolerance. So the area in which they are neither hyper-aroused, hyper-vigilant, reactive, agitated, more anxious, or emotionally shut down, numb, unable to process, or what we call dissociated, becomes very narrow. And, there's a process in therapy of trying to extend the ability where people can tolerate emotions within that window of tolerance, where they're neither hyper-aroused and hypo-aroused. And what people will see in groups when people are triggered is that people become overwhelmed. They start to show these signs of agitation or hyper-arousal. Signs of hypo-arousal can be harder to see. People may be perceived to be depressed, but actually being shut down is actually also an agitated state, which just presents differently. But people who've experienced trauma can come and go between those different states, very regularly. And certainly in my own experience, I experienced a lot of panic attacks and a lot of anxiety, but I also experienced a lot of dissociation. Dissociation is, I think, a very creative mechanism in which the brain protects itself from being overwhelmed.
Cathy, could you maybe explain what dissociation is? Because some of our
so dissociation is we all dissociate to a degree, so it's a continuum. So when we're driving along a highway, we're not conscious of what we're doing to make the car work.
Yes.
We're just driving. So we're not fully aware of that. But with dissociation, there's a disconnection between, being consciously aware and parts of your experience and your thoughts and your feelings, and things become very compartmentalized. An extreme form of dissociation is what's called dissociative identity disorder. Used to be called multiple personality disorder, and it's been very creatively represented in film. But what it is a protection of the brain, that when it would be overwhelmed by all the trauma that's occurred, the brain cuts things up into bite-sized chunks which are separated from one another, so it becomes manageable. But part of the process of healing is to try and make all those parts work together and be integrated, so that all of those functions can work together for a fully aware, functioning human being. But we need to acknowledge how brilliant a defence that is.
Absolutely.
And stop sensationalising it.
This is all kind of tied to things like attachment. Why is attachment important, and why do we need to understand this?
Look, we're all connected beings, or we should be connected beings. And when in childhood, a child doesn't receive the mirroring or the attunement of a caregiver, they can't attach very securely.
Yes.
And so we all need a consistent presence when we're growing up, so that we can help make sense of our own emotions, of what we're observing about the world. When that doesn't happen, people develop all sorts of insecure attachments, and it means it can be much more challenging for them to manage their emotions, because they don't learn that during those childhood years. And just want to say that people can learn it later on. It's not that it's gone forever. But if you've been in a situation where you don't have a consistent caregiver who keeps you in mind, or helps to hold you, or helps you to feel safe, or you can trust, when you have someone who's meant to be nurturing you, but they're harming you, what sense does a child make of that? So attachment is very critical in terms of developing a safe base to build your sense of self, your ability to empathise with others, and to manage those emotions.
How important are just relationships and connection then in the course of somebody's life, Cathy? Can reconnection help?
Yeah, absolutely. Relationships are absolutely vital. We know that, just as the damaging relationships of abuse affect the way brain pathways are laid down, we know that positive interactions can help them to repair. The good news is that with understanding now of neuroplasticity, we understand the brain can heal and repair. Previously there was just a sense that there was no hope with the brain, that it was just you got a certain number of neurons and then they just died. That is absolutely not true. And what we know is the absolute critical importance of positive relationships of trust, relationships of safety, relationships of consistency. And that's very important in groups, that people can start to change the script in their brain, which is that, people are dangerous. I can't rely on anyone other than myself. And what we find is that many people who experience trauma isolate themselves because they don't trust, and they have been hurt before. And they're often re-hurt in systems of care as well.
So how can we make sure that we keep people safe then in a smart group? What would that look like? What would holding somebody in a safe space involve? Look,
safety involves meeting someone in the place they're at. It doesn't mean digging into someone's trauma, asking them to relive the details of what happened to them.
And
it's
that's
about
how people in the here and now in smart meetings.
It's about how people are in the present, what they need. And really, if you have a sense that someone is becoming overwhelmed and moving out of their window of tolerance, perhaps say something gentle, such as, I can observe that, maybe you're feeling X, or I've observed that, your shoulders are tightening and stiffening, maybe not directly in the group, but maybe, separately, because people who've experienced trauma often feel a lot of shame, and so, the group can best judge that depending on their relationship with the person. But it's about, helping the person to become more aware of their own body reactions, because a lot of trauma is stored in the body, and being aware of that, and then how to help them ground themselves and manage that level of stress. And so maybe it's about suggesting that the person takes a break, that I don't know how your groups work, but if there's someone to go, with them so that they're safe, they may want to stretch, they may want to go for a walk, have some time outside, they may have, breathing may be helpful for them, they may, have used, people have all sorts of resources that help them to feel safe, internal and external. So go to that safe space, try and reconnect in with their senses, reconnect in and ground themselves in the present.
Yeah, they're great strategies, Cathy. Thank you. So if we were to kind of try and explain to somebody else what trauma-informed care looks like, what is it? What does it mean, this expression, trauma-informed care? Yeah,
look, trauma-informed care means being aware of what may have happened to someone along life's journey. You don't have to know what the details are, but just keeping the possibility of trauma in mind, and that the way people present their behaviours, which often can appear challenging, their triggering or reactivity, their tendency to catastrophize or to be highly emotional, all make sense in the context of what happened to them. So just really keeping an open mind. We're all very good at judging.
Yeah.
But it's, when we judge without knowing and understanding, we're not doing them or us any favors.
Yeah.
So it's about understanding the stress response, understanding our own stress response, because we all also have reactions. And so checking in with ourselves as well, particularly, when facilitating a group, when people are, having these reactions.
Yeah. It's
about working with people, not doing to them or doing for them, not taking over. These are the core principles of trauma-informed practice, and they really seem very simple. But unfortunately, our modern world has moved right away from things that are really human quite often. And often when people need the most care, they often get the least. People who are admitted to mental health wards, I think on average they spend 11 minutes with the nurse every day. When we know that people have been harmed in interpersonal interactions. They need, positive interactions, and, safety is, absolutely critical. We say safety, 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 because many people who've experienced trauma have never felt safe. That's an alien concept, and we need to not impose our sense of what safety is, but find out from the person what safety means for them, what helps them feel physically and emotionally safe, and they may really struggle with that.
Yeah.
The next principle is trustworthiness. And again, when people have been betrayed, and, we've seen there's been a lot, obviously, in the media recently, particularly about the Catholic Church, and they're not the only people, institutions that have betrayed people, but, the absolute betrayal of trust that's occurred and how long it can take to repair that. So what needs to happen is that we need to be open, we need to be honest, we need to be transparent. We need to do what we say. And when we stuff up, we need to own it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And set some boundaries, which are not rigid boundaries, but, firm, supportive boundaries, because they help to contain people.
Yeah, they do.
Give people choice, because, again, when you've been abused, a child has no choice about being abused. And that's why people, really try all sorts of ways to control the situation, because they felt so out of control. As we said before, to work with people, because, again, abuse occurs in an imbalance of power.
Yes.
And so how do we really work with people and honour their lived experience? Because people are an expert in what happened to them.
Yeah.
So how do we share that power? And how do we help people to empower themselves? So many people who've experienced abuse don't, have very low self-esteem. They don't see that they have any strengths at all. They can really struggle to see what they can bring, the skills that they have. So it's really important to help people identify their strengths. This is about the whole thing about trauma-informed practice, is that it's strengths-based.
Yes.
Many of our systems are deficit-based. The biomedical model is what's wrong with you, what's your pathology, what's your diagnosis. This is about helping people to find and build on their own strengths and a sense of agency, so that they can become, a very powerful healing agent of their own, because that's so much more valuable.
Absolutely. So what could a smart facilitator do to kind of form a trauma-informed relationship and bond with everybody in their group? What would that look like?
Well, it's obviously hard because everyone's coming with a different story. So I want to acknowledge that it's not easy.
Yeah.
And there will be different people reacting at different times. So how to hold a group can be challenging, because you're not only dealing with a person's individual reactions, you're dealing with your response to those reactions, and you're dealing with the other responses within the group.
Yeah.
But it's about having those group rules is a bad word, but group understanding, a shared language, shared expectations, that sense of safety.
Yeah.
I don't, again, know how much flexibility you have in where and when people can meet, but, making it as welcoming as possible.
We have great flexibility. Sometimes some groups even meet in nature, not in a room.
Yeah, exactly. So that's right. Having a nurturing environment, being aware of when someone may be starting to feel overwhelmed and trying to, catch it early and support them through that.
What can we do to kind of support just moving back into that window of tolerance, do you think, if somebody is having a hard time?
Yeah, well, I think it is about, maybe taking them, assuming the rest of the group is looked after, and, taking them aside and saying, look, I've noticed that, you're seeming, you're not yourself tonight.
Yeah.
How are you feeling? What do you think you need? How can I help you? Because I really want to help you. I'm here to support you. Is there anyone that I can call? Just really checking in with them.
Sure.
And then, as I talked about all of those other tips around, if they are outside of their window of tolerance, how to help ground them and how to help.
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry, you finished?
No, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Lots of the people that I've met in certainly my group have sometimes used alcohol or other drugs as part of a coping strategy. Could you talk us through why that might be the case for lots of people?
Yeah, and I think we've got a slide that looks pretty dramatic because it's got lots of pictures. But I think we need to, understand what coping strategies are, because traditionally, the medical model would call these symptoms and call them, dysfunctional behaviours.
Yeah.
But in people who have agitated nervous systems, which is what we're talking about as a result of stress, it makes total sense that people will look at how to distract themselves, how to numb their distress, how to remove some of that angst. And we know that people use all sorts of different ways of numbing themselves and trying to remove that angst. And these are called adaptations, and they're very protective. They help people to survive, and we need to acknowledge them for what they do and what they achieve. And it's very important that we stop, blaming people for their own very creative survival strategies, but we also need to support people to find other ways of being when strategies aren't so constructive. But we know that, a reaction to trauma can be, overwork, becoming an extreme athlete. And those, are in the same category as people who are using alcohol and drugs, but they're much more socially acceptable.
Can it also be about timing, Cathy? So can some coping strategies work well for a time and then become less?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think the main thing is to celebrate the survival and the resilience of people to have them. And then, just be aware that, to remove a coping strategy when, there aren't more resources and that people have not developed other strategies can be problematic. So it's very important to be very gentle with this process and help people to build those internal resources, to find out what helps support them externally, who they have in their support networks, how the groups can support them, so that, other strategies, which now are more constructive, can start to replace those that are less constructive, and creating, a lot of challenges, most for the people who are using them, but also often for people who are interacting with them. And if people interacting with them don't understand those strategies, they're going to really judge them and be punitive.
For sure. So what else could we do to support resilience and coping, do you think, in our role as facilitators?
Look, supporting resilience is about, firstly, it's very, very important to hold hope, a sense of hope, and a sense of optimism. And we know people can and do absolutely recover. We know that from the neuroscience, and we know that anecdotally. And so there can be long periods where people don't see the hope themselves.
Absolutely. So is that partly about building sort of confidence, self-esteem, things like that in the people that we work with?
Absolutely. And again, helping people to connect in with their strengths. Yeah. Just saying, you're amazing. Yeah. Look what happened to you, and look, you're here. Look what you're doing.
And building confidence and capacity to change, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're coming to the group and you're connecting and you're making connections. I know that was really hard, and you couldn't have done that a year ago. So really starting to help people connect into the progress they've made and what's positive in their lives, and help them to also reach out to see what else they can engage with. Help them identify what it is they love to do, because it can be very hard for trauma survivors to actually know what they want, and to actually, or to feel that they're worthwhile enough to actually get it as well. So to really just help to build, those possibilities. It's about being open to possibilities.
For sure. And how do we support survivors to participate in their own recovery, do you think?
Well, I think there's, again, by saying that recovery is absolutely possible, And, you know, stories of recovery are very inspiring for other survivors. I think helping people to build a narrative of their own life. I think stories can be very helpful, and people find different ways of expressing themselves helpful, whether it's writing or art therapy or something experiential. So just any way of helping people to understand that what happened to them was wrong, that there's nothing wrong with them, that they, you know, can find a way to a life that's worth, you know, much better worth living, that they are important, that they're valuable, that they're participating members of society, just really helping on those strengths and helping them to understand that there's nothing wrong with them.
For sure.
What
and
happens?
Just for our facilitators as well, Cathy, what can they do to kind of exercise some self-care?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's
maybe aware of it, like stuff we're wearing sometimes.
Obviously, can be very challenging to support people and to bear witness to people who've experienced, you know, extreme adversities which should never happen to anyone, and to also be facilitating groups in which there are lots of challenges where, you know, some of these adaptations and behaviours can be very difficult. We know that vicarious trauma is a cost of doing the work. It's not a sense of weakness. You know, like trauma, it's not about willpower or lack of willpower. It's this is what can happen when people are working with people who've experienced trauma or exposed to traumatic material. So it's very important for people, for facilitators, to be very aware of themselves, to check in with themselves and their own stress levels, to check in that they're not letting go of all of the things that keep them resilient. They're not stopping engaging with family and friends and social events, and they're not, you know, not taking those long walks into nature or listening to music or going to concerts, and that they're not becoming jaded in the world. They're not starting to, their worldview is not changing. They're not starting to see the whole world as overwhelmingly bad, but can actually, also stay hooked into the power of recovery. And what we know is that, you know, people who are on a path to recovery can actually, you know, grow way beyond their trauma. It's called post-traumatic growth. And the same with vicarious trauma. There's something called vicarious resilience. And that's also, you know, growing from the experience of bearing witness and seeing people's recovery, which is simply inspiring.
It is, and it's a bit of a privilege to watch as well. So, Cathy, I'm just going to at the very end for your top tips on how to keep our conversations trauma-informed. And in the meantime, I'm going to invite any of our participants to text us some questions if they would like to. So we'll have a couple more minutes of questions, and then feel free, guys, to post away. And Cathy will be with us for about another 15 minutes, I think. Cathy, just in terms of your top tips, what do we need to do to keep the conversation trauma-informed? Do you think?
So top tips, So top tips are know who you're in the group and understand.
Just paused all that.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Sorry, Cathy. Sorry, guys, just wait 1 sec. We're getting Cathy back, but she's just paused for 1 second. Cathy, are you back? Sorry, guys, bit of a technical hitch. We'll be back with you in 1 second. We're just kind of disconnecting Cathy, and we'll reconnect with her as soon as we can. Just bear with us for 1 minute, sorry.
She's lost her internet connection.
Okay, guys, it appears that Cathys lost her connection. So you're welcome to text me any questions that you might have, and we're still trying to get Cathy back if we can. So hang around and feel free to field some questions in the meantime. I think there's just an internet problem in Victoria where Cathy is currently.
Cool. We actually have a few questions in the question tab that we can, I don't know if you can view those, but we've got some questions that we can actually start answering if you want.
All right. So I'm looking at the questions that are coming into me.
Oh, that's lovely. We'll get you to...
Is that Cathy back? Maybe?
Let's see.
I just heard a beep, so it could be.
No. All right, we'll get copy this. So do you want to answer one of the questions? So I think we might as well start answering questions so we can get Cathy back in. Can you say the questions?
So yeah, I've got some questions here, guys, and I'll just start answering them. And we're still trying to get Cathy back if we can. So I've got a question here. In a group, if someone is noticeably triggered, can the co-facilitator pull them aside in a nice way? Absolutely they can, and that's what's really, really important and great about having a co-facilitator. That would be the co-facilitator's role. Language, and we've got Cathy back.
I'm so sorry. The internet.
No problem. So we were just in the middle of getting your top tips on how to be trauma informed in the work that we do.
Yeah. So, I mean, the main thing is establishing safety and maintaining safety in the group. Safety from the point of view of all of the attendees. And then, gradually over time, building the trust within the group, establishing those boundaries. I'm sure you've got ground rules that you establish, but keeping them flexible, not keeping them too rigid. Making sure that everyone has an opportunity to be part of it, so no one's feeling they don't have power and the choice to be involved, and just really, trying to be with each person on their own journey, to really help them, start to believe in themselves and start to, see what they have achieved and what they can achieve, and build, help to provide them with some possible resources that can help them along the way to build those strengths.
Mm-hmm. Where can people find out more, Cathy? What are the resources available to people at the moment?
So look, I mean, Blue Knot has a lot of resources. I mean, it's mainly around childhood trauma, but we have a lot of resources about trauma informed, how to, talk about trauma, how to have safe conversations, how to respond to triggers, grounding. There's a lot of information. There's videos and fact sheets and, a lot of different resources to give a very comprehensive understanding of trauma and its impacts and its stakes, but also very much to talk about, the possibilities of recovery and how to enable it.
Yeah. And people could go to your website, Cathy, to find out more? Yeah,
so that's Blue Knot, knot.org.au. We also have a helpline, 1300 657 380, and that operates 9 to 5, Monday to Sunday. And we can have, it's not just for survivors, mainly for people with lived experience, but also for people supporting them, for practitioners.
Well, certainly I found your guidelines when I was still overseas, and I've used them in about every NGO role ever since. So they're enormously practical and useful guidelines.
Yeah,
so I'd strongly recommend everybody having a look at them. They're great.
Yeah, there's two sets of guidelines there. One is for people working more clinically, but then the trauma-informed guidelines were really very much about what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Cathy, I've just got some questions coming in, and I know we've only got you for another 10 minutes or so, but one of the questions is, how useful or not is it to tell the info symptoms about trauma to someone you're dealing with who's experiencing trauma? Does it help them to know this descriptive stuff, or does it compound the sense of being overwhelmed, do you think?
Look, it depends on a lot of things. So, it depends on your relationship with them. It depends on, what space they're in at the time. But some psychoeducation can be very helpful because what it does is help to normalise people's reactions. And we find that we run workshops for survivors, and we find that people have a great sense of relief when they no longer feel like an alien. When we're saying, but of course, this just makes so much sense with, given what you've experienced. And when people are in a room with other survivors, even though what happened to them is so unique and different, many of what they're feeling and their reactions, are just so much in sync. It can actually be very valuable. But, it needs to be done in a way that's sensitive, that doesn't overly bombard. And people need to be receptive, because at times it can be really hard to take stuff in.
Yeah, for sure. Cathy, one of the other questions that's just come in is, somebody said, one challenge I come across is educators and other professionals dismissing trauma responses and associated behaviours. Instead of dismissing stuff, what can we do that's more useful than that? Yes,
look, it's something we come across all the time. This is a process of progressive education and understanding. There is a very predominant model around mental distress, and that's one of diagnosis. And what it doesn't do well, and not saying diagnosis is absolutely useless, but what it doesn't do well is ask why, ask what happened to someone. And we know that we need to look at cause. We need to look at people. People don't live in isolation. We need to look at people in the context of their lives, in their social context, their cultural context. Look holistically. And so a system that just looks at symptoms is not helpful. We're human beings. We're complex.
For sure. I've got a couple of questions too, Cathy, about just screening and assessment within a group. Like, what can you do to just kind of notice where somebody might be coming from when they are sitting in a group? There's no formal screening process. We don't have any attendance data even about the people who are attending, but what can we do just in terms of reading cues from the body, for example, about noticing people's levels of distress?
Yeah, look, I think it is about noticing the non-verbal cues, their posture, their gestures, their levels of distress, their agitation, whether they're spaced out, glazed. All of those are very important cues. In fact, we get a lot more from the non-verbal sometimes than from the verbal. That is a way to start to be aware of the likelihood of overwhelm. And the more we know people, so I'm sure facilitators become very familiar with who's in their groups, you can start to see the change and start to see that maybe on a particular day something's obviously triggered someone. And then you start to, see how you can support them through that.
Great, Cathy. Well, I think you've answered most of our questions for now. There might be more later. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, or more that you'd like to say even about Blue Knot before we finish today?
Look, Blue Knot is, a small NGO, like a lot of small NGOs, trying to do a great deal and trying to change the world. But what we know is that, sadly, there are infinite ways in which people can experience trauma and adverse experiences. And we know how critical it is to people's lives. And we know how important it is for us all to be understood, to us all to be respected and treated as human beings, because we can all be vulnerable. That's not a label of shame. So this is about compassion, empathy, and understanding.
Right, and it's noticing that we're all a bit flaky and badly put together, all of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, we're human.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Cathy, for your time. I think I've learned lots, and I hope everybody listening has as well. And thank you very much for your generous time, because it's not often that we get to learn and understand in this way. So thank you.
It's a pleasure, and apologies about the internet.
Not your fault at all. Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah,
Great to have you with us.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks
you so
much.
much. Okay. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, guys, for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the webinar. There'll be lots more to come. Keep posted and keep looking at our website. Have a look at Blue Knot's website as well for some resources. And thanks very much for joining us today.